He rose to power by stoking fears, declaring his opponents enemies of the state, and overwhelming the press and the public with one lie after another. No, not him. I'm talking about Joseph McCarthy, the infamous senator who used his office to lead a communist witch hunt at the height of the Cold War. His largely baseless claims destroyed the lives of many he accused, ultimately prompting this historic condemnation from the Army's then chief counsel, Joseph Welch.
Little did I dream you could be so reckless and so cruel. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
McCarthy's rise and fall is now the focus of a new episode of American Experience, premiering next week. I'm joined by the film's writer, director, and producer, Sharon Grimberg. Sharon, it's a pleasure to meet you. The film is just knocks your socks off. It's unbelievable. Thank you
so much.
So this all started in 1950 with a young, virtually unknown senator going to Wheeling, West Virginia to give a speech to some Republican women's group. Is that where it all started?
That's exactly right. McCarthy wasn't doing very well. His Senate career wasn't taking off, and he went to Wheeling, West Virginia in February of 1950 and gave a speech claiming there were 200-plus communists in the State Department.
Were there?
No.
Did he have any idea if there were communists in the State Department?
He had some inkling that at some point in the previous few years, a few people had been on some list as maybe having some suspicions against their names, but he had no idea whether they still worked for the State Department or whether they'd been cleared.
And the reason this gains steam, from as I said to you when I met you, I learned so much from this film that I didn't know, that I was embarrassed that I didn't know. I mean, obviously, his demagoguery was at art form level, but also the environment for a person like McCarthy to move center stage was exactly right, wasn't there?
Yeah, people were scared. People had legitimate fears about Soviet expansion across Eastern Europe. The Soviets had just exploded the first atomic bomb, their first atomic weapon test, and Americans were nervous. They didn't want to be in another war. I mean, the economy was taking off, and they really were scared.
Early on, was he a true believer or just like a sadistic opportunist? What was he?
I think that he jumped on an issue that gave him traction, and once he got the press and publicity that he got after Wheeling, he realized this was really an issue that could make his name.
You know, if I wasn't living in this time, and Scott Ferguson just mentioned her, and I had seen that only one senator, the only woman senator, a Republican, Margaret Chase Smith,
yes,
from Maine, with her Declaration of Conscience, essentially stood alone in terms of condemnation amongst colleagues, right?
She did. She wrote a Declaration of Conscience and tried to encourage people to sign on, and a few did, but then they kind of abandoned her.
Why did most of his GOP colleagues go along with this?
Because it was hard, because McCarthy had gained a lot of notoriety and he'd gone traction with the voters, and it was kind of dangerous, I think, for them to speak out against him.
Okay, and then all of a sudden, young Roy Cohn, who most of us know for other reasons, we'll get to that in a couple of minutes, one of the prosecutors, obviously the Rosenbergs, who were ultimately sentenced to death, he enters the scene as, how would you describe his relationship with McCarthy?
Well, he was sort of the brains behind the operation in many ways. He was organized. He had lots of names to bring up. He was the person who suggested who they subpoena. He was he had been involved in the Rosenberg's trials of the Rosenbergs being found guilty of espionage. So he really was McCarthy's right-hand person.
What happened to? I know there's not a obviously, they're all different stories. I just touched on it briefly at the beginning. What happened to the people who were called before this committee?
Well, many of them lost their jobs. I mean, if you were accused of being a Fifth Amendment communist, which is what McCarthy would call people who would take the Fifth Amendment, then you could be fired and you'd lose your job. One man, actually, a Voice of America engineer, killed himself before being called to testify. He was scared. So people's careers and lives were really impacted.
You know, as depressing as all this is, there are some moments in this that are so heartening. It's unbelievable. Edward R. Murrow, who even young people watching, who, even if they never saw him, heard of him. I think it was 1954, am I right?
Yes, 54.
There's this moment, and the most respected news person in America, here's a little piece of what Murrow had to say.
We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. The line between investigating and persecuting is a very fine one, and the junior senator from Wisconsin has stepped over it repeatedly.
That was a huge moment. You also say in your film, which I love, is he went across the street to have dinner at Sardi's, a legendary place in New York City, and he got a standing ovation from the crowd. That is such a great thing.
It is.
But that was a critical moment.
For me, it's what this film's about, really, that democracy is fragile and that we all have to protect it. And I think that's the moral of the story, that if you see democracy being derailed, we as citizens and representatives, and we need to stand up and correct the course.
Well, then let me jump ahead to something. Since you said democracy derailed, I am assuming, I've read nothing about why you decided to do this project. I'm assuming that you decided in part to do this because we're in the age of Trump. Is that accurate?
Actually, it's not.
Really?
I mean, the film has been in gestation for a very, very long time. And in fact, American Experience first came up with the idea in 2003, which is when the transcripts of the executive sessions were declassified and made public. And
but you don't get into Trump at all in this, but I should say, I know this is not original thinking for anybody that's seen your film so far. There is almost not a frame where I didn't sit back on my couch and say, oh my God, from, he's censured 67 to 22 when his colleagues finally stand up against him. He calls it a circus, almost exactly what we heard from Donald Trump after the impeachment vote. He's accuses people of treason and being traitorous when he has absolutely no evidence. He has friends in the press who come to his rescue, McCarthy, when he's in. I mean, the parallels are shocking, are they not?
I mean, I think you can see a lot of parallels to today, a lot of parallels between an administration, that McCarthy, who threatened members of the press, that he didn't like what they were saying. James Wexler is called up in front of his committee because he takes issue with McCarthy.
New York Post, right?
Yeah, New York Post. So there are a lot of... McCarthy he got into a physical fight with Drew Pearson, another newsman that he didn't like. There's also the same kind of, I think, there was at that time this fear, and I think that McCarthy played on people's fears, and I think you see the same kind of fear-mongering today. That's a similarity. You
said the takeaway is how fragile democracy can be, but it also, the heartening part of this to me was that one person can make a difference. Now, admittedly, Murrow was unbelievably powerful, but no one ever heard of Joseph Welch, with the Army counsel in this case, before he decided to say those words, even though he took the low road on some things a little bit later, as you show as well. So that's part of the takeaway, too, is it not? That one strong, relentless voice can really change history, no?
Yeah, I personally believe that Murrow himself made a huge difference, because he laid out for people McCarthy's lies. He told people exactly what McCarthy was doing. And at that point in 1954, I mean, there wasn't much to watch on television. If you were sitting down to watch TV, there were very few choices. And I think a lot of people watched. And if you look at the polling data, actually, you'll see that McCarthy's ratings plummet in March. They were very high at the beginning of the year, and they go down after the broadcast.
Well, he made a difference, and I would just suggest you're going to make a big difference, too. This thing is great.
Thank you
Thanks
so
much, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Sharon Grimberg, McCarthy premieres right here on GBH2, Monday at 9 o'clock.